Oh, here he is. I have a text message from Dr. K. Confused. What is Riverside? I believe it's an Irish form of dance. I'm not quite sure.
He was asking me to pay $9. I don't know. I just didn't realize I could be a guest. All right.
I almost brought my really fancy headphone that we got for the original season of Caraheard in from my office. I even put it in its bag, and then I left it there. So I have to use it as a headphone. Cleverly.
Nice.
I must confess that I didn't just bring a few. I brought all the books.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I'm going to be book shamed.
Every book sits behind 4 other books. I'm only going to talk about one book, but there's 4 others behind it that frame it. So I just brought a whole pile. Yeah.
Just in case. Right.
I just can't decide.
Look, have I ever shown you my these fancy Corbett versus Dempsey Sun Ra reproductions?
Oh wow!
And they've been reproduced like really authentically to the original, the original typed. I mean, you can't really see it on the little grainy camera, but they're really totally unnecessary things. But even some of them that were album inserts are reproduced as little album inserts that are just loose sheets of paper, and in the original like blue mimeograph forms.
Yeah. Nice. Oh, I'm looking way too stuffy for this. I gotta. Oh yeah, that's much better. There.
Do you get a special provost office, or is that just your?
Oh no, this is the special provost office with stuff.
What's the provenance of all those artifacts behind you? Have you checked them all? Or are they stolen from indigenous native lands?
I have, of course I have. It's very opportunistic, and they're all gifts from Asian universities, because when you get distinguished visitors from other universities, which universities bring you gifts? Asian universities.
Sure. That makes sense. I have a place in my office where I've been collecting all the gifts that Asian students have given me, with the hope of at some point displaying them. But of course, I never will, because I'm afraid it will be very inappropriate to, in any way, stigmatize that gift exchange culture or, thematize it. But I have a special section.
It'll put pressure on future students too when they walk in and they see what their peers have given them. It'll create a little economy of its own.
Yeah, I just love it. They're so dear to me because they are so incredibly thoughtful. And I mean, I do have one on my door, which is actually a fan that a student commissioned to with my name in Chinese characters.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I have another shelf, which isn't on camera, that has normal sort of stuff, higher ed and and how to bureaucratize your bureaucracy, normal administrator type books that I'm going to swap out with a bison bone from North Dakota, 5000 BC, and an Atari cartridge, and personalize the office. Digital press books, exactly.
Copies of North Dakota Quarterly.
So
but for some reason aren't.
I'm going to move over the dean's office collection, but it's been like a highs of 9 degrees, which to Bill is warm, but I'm not moving nothing till the weather warms up, which was this afternoon. We're up to 35, so that move will happen tomorrow and the day after. So
we're in the mid-20s here, so this is the halcyon days.
Yeah. So we should. So this is the reboot of. It's not reboot. We've been on a very brief, probably a COVID hiatus. We'll just go with that. So it was what? Season 3 ended 6 months ago.
What? I actually have no recollection of season 3. I thought we did season 2, but maybe I'm confused. I don't know.
I think we did season 3, but it's been, I don't think we've done an episode since I moved to Michigan.
Nah.
So the page says it's been many, many years, but I prefer the lie. We went on a brief COVID hiatus, as many people did, but now we're back for, let's say, season 4.
Yeah, it is season 3. 5 years ago, Richard. Oh, there you go.
Well, I mean, we're cutting edge. We knew it was coming and wanted some prep time.
Let's just emphasize the slow archaeology, right? It's like
Right.
we've gotten so slow that we've almost rejected anything that involves social media.
Yeah, we refuse to operate on the pace of the digital.
Yeah.
But one thing we consistently did wrong, absolutely every episode, and so we're in season 3 or season 2?
Season 4.
Season 4. So one thing we consistently did wrong in season 1, 2, and 3 is we never introduced ourselves. And since we're an audio podcast, we're supposed to say, I'm Richard Rothus, so that they can associate a voice with a name. So, I'm Richard Rothus.
Oh, that's my turn. I'm Bill Caraheard.
And I'm Kostic Kourelis.
All right. And I guess it's your, Bill, it's your podcast. You invented it.
I think I've passed the baton to you. You're the host. How's that?
Oh, okay. Well, we're back for season 4 of Caraheard, which is a meandering podcast. I think probably best to say it's about material culture and the lives of people who study material culture. Would that capture it?
That's good.
Yeah,
Because we don't always just talk about material culture. We talk about things that are happening in our lives, but not in some weird, creepy way about how's my toenail fungus doing. It's fine, by the way. It was cleared up in our COVID hiatus. We really took care of that.
And I would add, with a special focus on the Mediterranean and America, right? Because there's whole sections of Asia, Africa Antarctica, that we don't
Right.
touch. That's
Yeah, I mean we're not anywhere near as smart as we think we are, or as broad in our knowledge.
we're broad for Mediterranean archaeologists, which means we
Right,
sometimes
we're
do 3 countries, maybe 4 on a good day. So.
Yeah.
Right. It's all contextual. So for Mediterranean archaeologists, we're insanely broad. But for the first episode of the new year, we traditionally come together with Kostis and talk about our favorite books we read last year. And I think in some previous seasons, the episode has run like 6 or 7 hours long. So we've tried to limit it. Bill, what was the genius selection criteria you came up with that we may have paid attention to?
Yeah, I think we said books that were one book that was recent, one book that is sort of that comes from any time, but could be a classic, and then one book that's came from this year. Isn't that what I said?
Yeah, I think the classic was one book that's might not be new, but is new to us.
New to us.
So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and then
Right.
and then recent, as in, again, like historians and archaeologists think of recent, which is before present in some way, or not before
Exactly.
present, rather. Sometime since 1950, recent.
Hold on, I'm gonna check.
And I'm going to completely disregard that instruction because I just have I just got buckets. I got buckets of books, and they're still kind of floating. There's no 1, 2, 3 yet, but there's 4 buckets.
4 buckets. Okay.
We were just glad you figured out what Riverside was. That's fine. Riverside. I guess Riverside is our because we're doing the demo version and not paying for our first hour. They can be our sponsor today. Unless this doesn't work, then they're not our sponsor anymore. We don't do sponsors, but
No.
but we said their
everything gets
name out
sponsored
loud.
by North Dakota Quarterly or the Digital Press. We can
That's
just keep
right.
layering those in so that
Our permanent sponsors. All right. So who wants to? We do have a time limit today, which will help us tremendously. Who's up first?
I think you are, Richard. You have to start. You're the host.
I had a tremendous reading year, courtesy of the virus. Because to escape from reality, I went almost entirely fiction. I spent a lot of time reading fiction, which I don't normally do. But so I do have one nonfiction, but and then since I'm still relatively new to Michigan, I also went fairly heavily Michigan themed. So I'm going to start with, this one is hot off the press. The ink's still wet. These Bones, Kayla Chenault, who I have not met. I know someone who knows her, so that's really cool. She describes herself as a practitioner of black girl magic. And Kayla, when she is not writing, Kayla is found at museums where she works, or is telling everyone about the history of popular music and social dance. So she's like nothing like me whatsoever.
Well, the museum thing sometimes.
But the museum, yeah, I mean, there's an intersection. She's very much into history. She actually works at the Detroit Historical Museum, which is a spectacular museum. And this is how I learned about the book. I was actually in a meeting with someone at the museum, and they mentioned it, and I'm like, "Whoa, wait, stop!" So what's that book?
What the book's called? Them Bones.
These Bones.
These Bones. Okay.
And it's I mean, I guess historical fiction, magical realism, archival work. It does not fit into any category I mean, some smart literature person would say, "Oh no, that fits into this category, and these are the antecedents." But I'm not that person. It's the Lyons family. They're in the Bramble Patch. It's a fictional setting, but part of it is based on a version of Detroit history. It's not set in Detroit, but there's bits of it. There's an underworld kingpin, the Bargist, who runs a brothel in one part of town. There's an antecedent, an opposite brothel run by a woman in another part of town. And it's, Kayla just drops you right into the middle of this thing. It's wonderfully confusing. I struggled with it at first because it's not linear. It's not unlinear, but it's not linear. And if your goal is to piece together the coherent story, why are you reading magical realism? That's not what magical realism is for. And it traces how these lives intertwine as the white part of town and the black part of town intersect. There's murders, or are they magical realism? There's conflict between families, and there's follows the lives of several individuals and families as they go through this. And the Bargist is the monster who tortures souls and engages in cannibalism. Is he doing it literally or is he doing it metaphorically? I have no idea. And because I finally figured out how to read the book, at least this is how it worked for me. By the end, I didn't care because that wasn't actually the part. I had to let that go and just go with the flow. But Kayla's done some wonderful things. She'll drop out of the narrative suddenly and go into some, there's historical photos. I mean, they're obviously not historical photos from this place that doesn't exist, but they're historical photos from somewhere. I'm really proud that I didn't hunt them down and break the bubble. I just went with it. There's newspaper accounts of events. There's some lynchings that are integral to the story. It's just wonderfully and beautifully and also horribly woven together. It's in my top 5 books I keep thinking about that I read in the year, all from a passing comment in, before we started a meeting. I'm really glad I found it.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been kind of like you in that I've been reading mostly fiction. I've probably been reading a lot of nonfiction, but when I sat down and tried to think of the books that I read for the year, I had like almost no recollection of any nonfiction that I read, other than the kind of bits and pieces that I cited for. I'm sure, and then I was thinking, oh well, I must have read that book this year. No, I read that according to my blog, at least like 2019 or 2018, right? So I lose. But the books that I read this year that were fiction seem to like stick with me more, and it may be for the same kind of escapist reasons. And like you, I was reading. I read. I think Kostis, you turned me on to Renee Gladman.
Oh yeah,
I think, these three or four. I think she has 3 little books now from the Dorothy Project at Washington University, and they're like magical realism, but heavy on the magical, right? I mean, I've never read anything, or I've read very few things like them, in the sense that it's that the books they don't make any sense really. They're almost pure poetry, right? They're completely ethereal, and if you try to make sense of them, the story intentionally confounds you. It doesn't go, and it also doesn't go anywhere. And to me, this was like completely refreshing, right? Especially as our public discourse has been so driven by statistics and numbers and this kind of drumbeat of like, trust the science, and that these things are all have this kind of like teleological or this sort of hyper rational kind of linearity to them. To read Glasman's books against that backdrop was just like absolutely what I needed. Totally refreshing. Totally, they take place in this kind of magical place. That's really, I think, that's basic structure, right, is a dream. It's like the architecture of a dream. So it loops onto itself. You suddenly find yourself you're in one place, but then you're in, very much like a dream, you're in a totally different place. And occasionally there's these like windows into a sort of rationality, but those are all so ephemeral. Right, like there's maybe some officials in the city. There may be some philosophy that undergirds. There's this famous author at one point that they're kind of looking for, but then they stop looking for it, like you do in a dream when you're obsessed with finding something, and then you for some reason you're not, and then you're like walking up the stairs in your mother's house, or in the Loring Annex, or wherever you end up being, right? Because it's your dream and it doesn't make any sense. And so I don't know. Along similar lines to what you're saying, that kind of literature I felt like I needed this year more than I probably have needed in the past. And whether that's because our world is increasingly taking on shades of magical realism, or because we're constantly being told that our world isn't actually magical realism, that this all really, really makes sense, and we have to trust that it makes sense and just do what everyone says we should be doing. I'm not sure.
Bill, if I can add, the one thing that I like about about Renee Gladman is that it's not magical realism in that there are these kind of willful associations to like free-willing stream of conscience kind of trajectories. It seems like there's always some kind of really tightly confined system or game that is being followed. Like it's the characters in search of something, and then it's very. I liked it because it's very archaeological in a kind of a surveyor's point of view. It's very analytical. So it's kind of in some way it's sort of the opposite in some way of the freewheeling magical realism, and then it becomes a little claustrophobic sometimes, but you're not really sure because the walls aren't there, and kind of reminded me of the kind of the school of the novel that everybody hates, but I used to like so much, like the Rob Grier, I think was the main author, like the new novel, these novels in the French novels in the 50s where someone kind of spends like 60 pages describing the shadow across a table, So I don't know if you get the same sense, but there's a kind of like mechanistic framework that's...
Right, and it's the tension between, I think, the narrator's mechanistic perspectives, right? And the idea that the narrator, the Houses of Ravika, right? The narrator has this job, and this job is to like do this thing. It's like, but the backdrop,
survey a house.
Yeah, exactly. Because the house may or may not be two places at once, right? And they're trying to resolve this problem with reality, but that problem is so it's a rational character within this world that is that is full of this magical realism, right? That the world is this dreamscape. And it's almost like a weird Freudian interpretation of dreams, like attempting to like rationalize your dream, because the narrator always believes the world is rational, right? But the reader, like through their eyes, the worlds aren't rational. I mean, the Event Factory, right, where the narrator goes out on a walk every time, but the walk they think they're following the same path, but like the world around them changes, right? So they're kind of desperate to find the world that they live in, or the characters in the hotel, and time seems to be like completely incapable or non-linear, even though the character lives in a world where there's an expectation of kind of linearity. So I don't know, maybe I'm not doing it justice. Great. Or
no, this is great. Yeah, I completely forgot about this. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to talk about my favorite piece of fiction because I think I'm in an audience that doesn't like Jonathan Franzen, but the new novel Crossroads just absolutely made my year. And the thing that I like about Jonathan Franzen is like reading a Dickens novel, which is just so there's so many pages to get to know a particular set of characters, but also the he's not postmodern he doesn't. There's a very kind of realistic expectation, like the 19th century novel, where the wordsmithing of these descriptions are just incredible. So you can kind of keep on rereading a sentence over and over again. So anyway, so Crossroads is the first of a trilogy, I think, that he's working on. That and I should preface, I think all the books that I've collected have to deal with somehow with archaeology. So I think what Crossroads does is it manages to capture 1970s America in a way that that is just very precise, and it's essentially it's a story that involves a family of who's the head of the family is a minister, and it's at the moment in American history where American religion is beginning to intersect with the civil rights movement, and there is kind of these youth groups that are very hippie and free-willing that begin to take over the church organization. There's missionary trips to the South that and that problematize everything. There's Vietnam. It's just so loaded with whatever felt like the 1970s, and I feel like because of that sort of attention to detail, and through this lens of that family, you experience the phenomenally that moment in time. But I'm not going to talk about that's not on my list. That's what's not on my list.
That's cheating. But I have to tell you, you've put me in. You and your love of Jonathan Franzen have put me into like this Jonathan Franzen confirmation bias loop, because everywhere I look, every magazine I open, every newspaper is like, oh, there he is. There's Jonathan. I walk over to the student union to get a cup of coffee, and I'm like, look at that guy in line. Is that him? Is that Jonathan Franzen? I mean, he's been everywhere since a few weeks ago. You mentioned your love for him.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, and I must say, like, The Corrections is probably still one of his first book, that got him, hated by everyone, in that he said, he's writing the greatest American novel, and then he actually did, and everyone just really pissed off that he pulled it off.
No, my next book is the greatest American novel, but keep going.
Yeah, but if we can make that count, but in some loose way, if you'd like, maybe I'll shift into more actual material culture, if you will. So So this is a I think all the books that I've selected either have to do with some question of archiving, of documenting, material phenomenon, or dealing with certain kind of heritage, different kind of media. So the books that I've made, some of them are about sort of ethnic heritage, some of them are about, another category is about food, another is about legacy data from an archaeological project, and another one is on a piece of gum, which I think I won't even have to bring in case it's on Bill's top list.
No.
But anyway, so the first book I would say is about food. So this is a book called Sweet Greeks, First Generation Immigrant Confectioners in the Heartland by Anne Fleser Beck. Now, this is the dissertation really of a Greek American whose family owned one of these confectionaries in Tuscola, Illinois, and sort of late in life, Fleser Beck went to get her PhD and started researching sort of her own, the sort of long history of Greek immigrants getting into sweet shops. But the thing that makes it really important is that her father owned one of those restaurants, and it had, like most of these early 20th century institutions, it had become, it had been boarded up, it had been, non-operational for like decades. And really her sister and her decided that they're going to revive it. So it really is, so she got involved in this kind of restoration project of taking this abandoned building, which was her family heritage, and both restoring it and making it work and making it actually extremely successful and kind of creating, even kind of generating whole hipster scene in the downtown of Tuscola, Illinois, but at the same time writing a very scholarly book. It's not earth-shattering in any way, but I think it's that sort of combination of doing this kind of scholarly work of documenting all the Greek confectionaries from the 20s in the state of Illinois, and then kind of interjecting those experiences, which are not even that visible in the book. It's through sort of other. For give a talk where what's revealed is this other project that she's partner to, but her sister is the main co-director. Anyway, but this focus on food, I should say, is also over COVID, when we probably ate too much and cooked a lot. There's a couple of other things that are kind of relate to Greek food that I want to just simply note. One is a cookbook, which I just love because everything I've cooked from it is amazing. It's by Yasmin Khan. It's called Ripe Figs. She's a British cookbook writer. Her best known book is called Zaytun, where she looks at kind of Palestinian and Jewish food. But in Ripe Figs, what she did is that she took this sort of journey through the itinerary of refugees and migrants. So she went through Greece and Turkey, and really it's almost a memoir, but mostly a cookbook. So every single thing I've made is just absolutely simple and delicious. And on the flip side of the United States, I think another really great book on this sort of topic of food history and institutions and restaurants is a book that I, to be honest, I read very quickly, but I absolutely love the premise of it. You might have heard of this this book it's called Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America by Marcia Chatelain. Mm-mm. And this is a book that basically argues that in the history of the African American community in the 50s and 60s, McDonald's, or the franchise, was really kind of a golden opportunity to create small business, to create black businesses, so that whereas we might look down on McDonald's as a corporate infrastructure, if you do kind of microhistory, you realize that because of the opportunity to franchise and own your own property, there was a kind of a great thrust of black businesses. And then she ultimately explains down the line, this is why kind of this African American deep-seated appreciation and commitment to McDonald's as a brand, because it really was used in a kind of almost like a corporate civil rights movement. So anyway, so basically, there's Ripe Figs, a cookbook, the Golden Arches franchise, and then this little history of Greek American confectionaries really kind of kept me busy in both cooking and thinking about food and the spaces in which we eat the food at a time where we couldn't really go anywhere. And so, yeah, so one book with 3 others behind it.
Nice.
Oh, one thing I should also say is that what you learn from the Sweet Greeks is that there's actually this other book called Rigby's Reliable Candy Teacher, which is basically a guidebook that was published by Rigby in the 1900s to teach you how to start an ice cream shop or a confectionery. And as it turns out, like basically Greeks that knew nothing about sugar or sweets just basically picked up this book and just follow it down to the detail. At the end, it actually even has instructions on how to set up your shop. And Flesnor, in fact, used this book to reconstruct the recipes in her, in her kind of reconstructed shop.
So cool.
But also used the original edition that her grandfather had with notes and changes of how to roll out the candy. So, of course, I couldn't resist to go on eBay and get myself a copy of
now,
it. And
since you are blatantly and obviously cheating on the premise, your penance is you have to send me a list of these books, so I don't have to listen all the way through the podcast again to get the list, because I could remember 3 books. I can't remember the 15 we're going to get to by the end with you. 6 books disguising under one. Okay, I'll go with my next one, which is also fiction. This is not new. It's new to me. I guess it was new to lots of people. It's Hard Rain Falling, Don Carpenter. It's 1964, so the year I was born. It's been reissued by the New York Review of Books. I saw the ad. It said it was noir, so I'm like, okay, whatever. I'll give it a try. New York Review of Books, their collection. I mean, sometimes you get them and it's like, man, that was stodgy. There's a reason that went out of print and you're having to reprint it. This thing, holy cow! It was a ride. There's Jack, the orphaned white kid who's roaming through cities, grifting and trying to be a what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, you're a card shark. Are you also a pool shark? This was an early read in the year. I've lost some of my 1960s vocabulary, but he's trying to scam people in pool halls and getting in fights and making trouble. He hooks up with Billy, a black teenager, also roaming the cities, and they intersect, and it's very dark and it's very noir, and they have all kinds of awful misadventures intersecting with police and crime and racists and an endless string of women, some married, some not. It's a dark, horrible mess. And then their lives disintersect, and there's success for one of them, and I don't want to give the plot away because people should live this, but buried within it are interracial love stories. There's a gay love story. There's a heroic murder, if that's a thing. There is no way in the world anyone would publish this if it was coming out as a new book today. Not just the language, which you couldn't publish anymore, but the themes and the bluntness and just the brazenness which Carpenter goes at these. And Carpenter was an academic. This is one of those books where to me, it feels like sort of the finger of God is transitioning through a person to write this. There's no apparent reason why Don Carpenter would have this book within him. It was his first book, and it's a nearly perfect book. It's not overdone. It's not underdone. It is truly amazing. And after I finished reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Someone has to know about this. So I messaged Jamie Ford, the author of Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, New York Times bestseller, about to become a major Broadway musical, motion picture author. He came to CMU here and gave a talk, and we chat online a little bit. I'm not saying he's my best friend, but we're in touch. I said to him, I said, I don't know if you have the time, but I think this book is amazing. And then for months I was thinking, man, it's probably terrible that he thinks I'm an idiot because I recommended this book. And he's like, wow, that guy doesn't know nothing. And then I just noticed on Twitter a few weeks ago he was recommending this book to some folks. So, it's nice to have confirmation that either we have equally bad taste or that someone else saw something amazing in this book also.
My reading list is getting longer as this conversation goes on. So the next book on my list is the first book. I didn't read it. I listened to it as an audiobook because I had to drive from Fort Myers, Florida, to Grand Forks, and it's about a 30-hour drive. And the podcast was something like 27 hours, or the recorded book was something like 27 hours. I mean, I was between Fargo and Grand Forks on 29 when the last pages were done. So I made it. But I read, listened to Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, his new book. And I picked it solely because, I like his stuff. We've talked about his stuff on Caraheard podcast now, 8 years ago. But I picked it almost solely because it was long enough to take up the entire trip. But it was actually pretty fantastic.
Right.
It was actually like a pretty fantastic book, and it's one that's there's I like John Dos Passos, and it's been compared to that, right? This kind of multivocality, use of multivocality, everything from, literally in the audiobook, but also short chapters. Each chapter is a different genre. Things that are sometimes pure narrative, things that are this weird interviewing style, things that are news releases. The characters kind of flicker on and off. Sometimes there are a couple characters that stay with the book the entire way through, and other characters that appear just for a couple episodes, and they just kind of, that's it. They disappear into the ether. And it's his book. It's his near future climate change kind of apocalypticism, and it got me thinking. The thing that struck me, I don't want this to be like damning by fake praise or something, but I remember sitting on a panel at one of our academic meetings on writing for a public audience about archaeology, I think, and everyone was sitting up in the front of the room. And it was a bunch of authors who had done this successfully, academic authors who had done this successfully. And, they're fine. Their books are fine. They're successful. Like, they will, in the end, sell more than everything I write combined entirely. One of their books probably has. And they all were preaching the virtue of writing in this kind of journalistic mode, right? That accessibility for them was all about writing like a journalist. And then they all at one point sort of joked about creative nonfiction being this kind of weird esoteric space, this kind of dead end, this thing that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, right? It's neither creative nor nonfiction or something. And then they went on to describe, once again, in this kind of like, I don't know, this sort of journalistic linear way, how they want to talk about, Bronze Age collapse or whatever their topics were. And I've read their books because they're people in my field. They give keynotes at my conferences. I appreciate their efforts to popularize and expand the audience for what we do. But I kept thinking that, like, Kim Stanley Robinson's book, which was not any great literary masterpiece in terms of his writing, was probably it was an infinitely more compelling read, and not just for its narration, but forcing me while I was driving my humongous diesel truck that was into a headwind, getting something like 7 miles to a gallon at one point, to confront like the horrors of climate change, and thinking that man, this idea that all of these plaintiff articles that I think CNN just has them just scrolled. They probably have them written for the next 20 years, and just every Thursday they put out like the next climate change article. It's sea turtles, it's quokkas, it's kangaroos, it's polar bears, it's squirrels, whatever animal is being, not to trivialize it, but you just read this stuff, you become
right.
desensitized. But reading Kim Stanley Robinson's work, for all of its limitations in terms of his work of literature or literary style or anything like that, created this incredibly indelible sense of urgency in my head about something that really, I hadn't. I have a list of things that I get agitated and urgent about, and they usually revolve very tightly around me. And this is, one of the few times where I actually thought, probably for a good, 6 months, this is probably something that matters more in the world than. So anyway, it's rare that a book kind of catches me like that, particularly a big picture book, like a big issue book. I often find they kind of fall a little flat. I think the Dawn of Everything is great, right? But it's not causing me to, create an anarchist commune in rural Grand Forks County or something. It's a fine book, but this book actually did really, really cause me to stop and think not only about how I lived, but more importantly, what we need to write to capture the attention of people in a world where the same narratives are being trotted out for every crisis, where you just swap out, it's not climate change now, it's COVID for a while. So we're going to write the same CNN story, but we're going to talk about COVID, or we're going to talk about Bronze Age collapse, or we're going to talk about whatever the next crisis du jour is. So.
It's Graeberization. Is that a word? We've Graeberized it.
Yeah, Graeber's great. Graeber wrote, but even Graeber in some ways, yeah. Graeber had some creativity. Graeber's stuff could be pretty creative and pretty interesting, but this goes beyond that even, right?
Yeah, I know I'm an outlier, and I'm sure that's a deficiency in me. I'm ready to embrace and admit that, but I'm just not a fan. I'm sure I probably just can't. He's too smart for me or something, but I'm just not a fan. You guys go for it. I support you fully, but I'm not part of that club.
First Franzen, now Graeber. Jeez.
I know. Maybe it's a letter cluster thing. We'll have to think about that.
All right, Kostic, what's your next 1 or 5 books?
Okay, yeah. Well, so maybe I should preface the next 3 books that are on the normal list by saying that they've all been weirdly selected. They've all 3 of them, number 2, number 3, number 4, they're all from projects that somehow failed or were interrupted by COVID or just simply didn't materialize. So these publications are in some way are the the rethinking of something that never happened, but so in sequence, right? So the first one is Warren Ellis's Nina Simone's Gum, and Warren Ellis is not a writer or an archaeologist, but he's a musician, and he played for Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, one of the greatest sort of post-punk heroes. In fact, Nick Cave was scheduled to have an exhibition that would be all his diaries, his crazy drawings, his translations of the Gospels. And I believe that exhibition never quite opened, or because of COVID. But what Warren Ellis contributed in this project was thinking through a piece of gum that he picked up from the underneath of a piano in a performance by Nina Simone. So the whole book is a reflection with various sort of points of connection about this object that is almost like a testimony to one of his heroes that he had an opportunity to kind of intersect with. And so if that one is about an exhibition that never happened and a piece of gum that becomes the centerpiece of a book, the next one is also about an exhibition that never happened. So the next book is called Sephardic Trajectories, Archives, Objects, and the Ottoman Jewish Past in the United States. It's a collection of essays edited by Kerem Tinaz and Oscar Aguirre Mandujano. So the reason why I'm sort of thinking about the Sephardic heritage is that, as you know well, the majority of the Jewish population in the Eastern Mediterranean was displaced from Spain. So in some way, the Jewish community in the Eastern Mediterranean, places like Salonika and Rhodes, has its own sort of special history. Now, this work is about the diaspora of that Sephardic community in the United States, and there's a huge community that evolved or developed in Seattle, Washington. So the project was, Tinaz is a professor at Koch University. So the project originated in having an exhibition of artifacts and archival stuff that has been collected by this diaspora in Seattle, to curate an exhibition that goes back to Koch University, to Turkey, and sort of completes the story and discusses this kind of complicated Ottoman diaspora. And for obvious reasons that proved to be just way too naive, and I think through the project, the contributors realized, wait a minute, there's actually some really complicated issues about, what happens if the objects get stuck. Then we have all of a sudden erased these histories. So this stands at the front of some really incredible work on Ottoman history that's coming out in the last couple of years. I mean, these young scholars that are, they have kind of the main positions in Islamic history throughout the United States. One of these books sort of behind this kind of Sephardic thinking is a book called Forging Ties, Forging Passports, Migration in the Modern Sephardi Diaspora by Davy Mays, who teaches at the University of Michigan. And then another book called Jewish Salonika Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece by Devin Nahr, who's professor at the University of Washington in Seattle and is one of the main contributors to the Sephardic Trajectories book. So I've been reading a lot about this sort of Sephardic diaspora in the United States. It's so fascinating because it completely defies any of the binary migration and trauma stories that we have. So particularly in an era of sort of social justice and framing things around race and ethnicity, the complexity of the different kind of roles of interchangeability of this diaspora community are fascinating. For example, that when they first arrived in the United States, they identified as Turkish, as Turkani. But then after the First World War, they realized they have this sort of Spanish, because of the linguistic connections, they could actually be more Spanish. So there was a kind of fluidity in how they defined themselves and how they associated, but also in a very important way, how they recreated in cities like New York City or Seattle or Chicago. They recreated the Ottoman Empire, because it was the only place in the world, in Chicago in the 1920s, where you could be hanging out, drinking, sipping coffee with Greeks and Syrians and Lebanese and Jews, right, in a way that wasn't possible back home after the kind of the nationalization of things. So that's my, and forgive me, I'm going through my whole list now because I have to leave around 5, right? So the Sephardic Trajectories is my number 3, and my number 4 is this book that I know you guys have heard of. It's produced by the American School of Classical Studies, Athens. You're like, what? But it's a book called Vrysaki, A Neighborhood Lost in Search of the Athenian Agora. It's a book by Sylvie Dumont, who happens to be the cataloger or the object curator of the Agora, very, very sort of seemingly boring and she's she's not the director of the excavation. She's not. But over the years, she has reconstructed the entire neighborhood that the American archaeologists destroyed in the 1930s through the photographic archive. So just like the Nick Cave exhibition that never happened, the Sephardic exhibition in Turkey that never happened, Risaki is about the neighborhood that doesn't exist, but has been reconstructed through the photographs and drawings of the very same people that destroyed it. And it's not particularly creative in the sense that you can't, like, unless you have already an interest in Greece, an interest in photography, an interest in archaeology, you probably won't get very much out of it, because it's really a kind of a really fundamental reference book. But over the course of the last year, I'm just finding myself just kind of opening it up and sort of time traveling through these photographs and understanding, and it's divided in different sections. Like there's a whole section on, speaking of refugees, the evidence of these refugee shanty towns in Athens, right, in the excavation site. But because the American archaeologists were so obsessed with documentation, they actually captured in great resolution, and I think now one can even, go through and reconstruct, like, how many pieces of plywood did it take for for someone who was essentially homeless to create a house in the middle of Athens in 1926, and we can do it through these photographs, or about public squares and about streets and about property. It stays away from all the big questions that people like Kamilakis and others have raised about colonialism, imperialism, and destruction of entire urban landscapes and kind of slum clearings practiced by the Americans. But what it reveals is that whatever that other conversation is about ideology and politics, and we have what we have in our hands is a record, and then a published record of the only neighborhood in Athens from the 1920s, because this neighborhood would have eventually been destroyed by 1960s renewal, right? Except that no one would have photographed it. So as we may critique the imperialists that destroyed the neighborhood, they're the ones that have given us the only possibility of actually seeing that period of Greek history, because no one else ever bothered to record it. So that's my entire list, but there are also little bits and pieces that kept me thinking about collections, and also all of these projects were not like grand visions of anything, but things that you could kind of pick up and go back in and get lost again, and sort of think about the world that you can't access, like you can't go to Greece because of COVID, right, or you can't go to a restaurant, because of COVID, or there are these other projects that had to be interrupted because of the international. So I think, forgive me how they're all kind of Eastern Mediterranean ethnic studies diaspora, but it seems like that's the kind of thing that I've been trying to untangle.
Nina Simone's gum is it Eastern Mediterranean?
Actually, it is. There is one there's a new wave 1960s Greek musician named Arleta that enters that crazily enters into the narrative.
I haven't read it yet. Actually, I had a very close call with Nina Simone just last night because a whole bunch of Amazon boxes arrived, and as happens, you guys know, I opened the first one. Is that a book? Yeah, it's a book. So you can get away with that. Yeah. And then I opened the second one. Oh, is that also a book? Yeah, it's a book. It was Mark Mazauer, Inside Hitler's Greece. And
oh, gosh.
It turns out I already owned Inside Hitler's Greece. I'm usually impeccably, wonderfully good about not duplicating, but...
the only way I find books is by ordering them. Like, books that I have on my shelf... Like, my shelves behind me, they're not organized in any way. So the only way I can find a book on that shelf is I have to go to Amazon and order it. And then it'll make it appear, and if I'm lucky, I can cancel my Amazon order in time. It's my method now.
Yeah.
The hardback copy of Inside Hitler's Greece appeared instantaneously because Paige had read it, but I had not, so she knew where it was on the shelf, and I was like, I know who this is a perfect gift for. And then I get to a third box, and the question is that a book also? And I'm like, no, it's gone. No, it didn't work. So,
I think maybe the Nina Simone thing is also framed by the Summer of Soul documentary.
Yeah. I haven't seen it yet, but it's on my list.
Oh, it's so good. I've watched it at least 2.5 times. There's also a Nina Simone documentary, which, as happens, you don't want to get to know your heroes. So
Well, after reading Nina Simone's Gum, I went and read and got her autobiography for the purpose of doing my own version of the Gum, which is basically to try to get as much primary source information about the times that she spent in Philadelphia, to actually go to try to figure out exactly at what corner on 52nd Street did she open her music shop, right? Where did she go to do her her examination at the at the music school. Anyway, so I had the ambitions to turn my own kind of create my Gum out of nothing, which
nice.
But partly because she's so central, I think, also with Summer of Love, and you think, wow, she's really complicated, and you're right, like she, her relationship with African leaders, and just a crazy figure.
But all these figures are like that. I mean, not to trivial. I mean, but like, not to jump the queue, but like, I was reading Black Fire, the Amiri Baraka anthology, right? And because I have this weird obsession with Sun Ra, and like these guys, Amiri Baraka's, I mean, this is saying the obvious, but is like not a simple figure, right? I mean, if Nina Simone is not a simple figure, like he's not a simple figure, and Miles Davis isn't a simple, like none of these characters are simple figures, and maybe it's kind of what makes it so compelling, and why a guy like Malcolm X or even Sun Ra have a capacity to resonate with a society that is with a society that is in some ways turned Martin Luther King into kind of not a caricature, but has simplified him so much that he can no longer represent the plurality of its experiences and priorities and motives and methods present in, particularly among Black activists today. He's become so simplified in that way. Whereas Nina Simone, right, is like some of her stuff is every bit as powerful as things that whatever. On Martin Luther King Day we see endlessly on social media, like.
Yeah.
Right. I think and I've forgotten if it's Amazon, Hulu, whatever, but the film brings that out really clearly, how incredibly powerful and filled with anger she was, and how much she wanted to turn her life in that direction, which I was vaguely aware of, but why would I just didn't know that it was part of my world. So it does a great job of that. But of course, it's much easier to live in my comfy little box than to be faced with, oh, this is music. Oh, it's nice. Than to be faced with that reality. But yeah, she's extremely complex.
But I mean, for me, it's and maybe Bill is sort of exploring this too. It's like I've always loved Nina Simone's music, right? And I just played it forever, but I never really, because it's music and exists in this sort of world, like I didn't think, why would I need to read her biography? Like it's the music that matters, right? Why do I need to thinking about the Gum or So I think it's kind of flipping it in a way that it may or may not have anything to do with the appreciation of the music and the work of the audio.
Right. It makes the music take on. I kept thinking of Nina Simone's Gum as having a kind of taking Simone's music and lending a kind of scriptural quality to it, where the Gum becomes then this relic, And of course, like I went and listened to the
Yeah.
pretty mediocre, to be honest, album of her singing like kind of pop standards, right? That was obviously like released at around the time. It must have been this concert that Ellis Goes
That
to
she was
was in support of that. And like I like Nina Simone. I like High Priestess of Soul. I like her early stuff. Like this is not the Nina Simone that I find, you know, especially compelling. Okay, fine. Like, but it kind of converts this album to kind of it gives this like I'm similarly ambivalent about Second Corinthians, right? Like it's not the best letters to the Corinthians. Let's just put it out there, right? Like it's just not. It's not First Corinthians. Let's just say it. But it has a canonical quality to it, and maybe I need to go back and think, you know, after all, like, I don't think Coltrane was, like, super excited about recording My Favorite Things. Like, this wasn't something that he was like, no, this, all right, fine, I'll do it, because maybe this will sell some albums, right? So, like, all of these guys then, but that's canonical now, right? And so maybe Nina Simone's Gum is the relic from this new canon that this Saint Warren Ellis has brought to our attention.
Yeah.
I've assigned it to my grad class on things this semester toward the end.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that's how it ended up on my reading list, because I was aware of it and I was going to skip it, but then it was on Bill's syllabus and I'm like, oh, that must be a sign. Okay, I'll read it.
I got in such a little rabbit hole that I was going to start trying to find some of the LPs starting with, and I think I was like, I'm starting from the beginning, so I thought I was going to, I never really quite did that, but, you know, Little Girl Blue, you know, 1958, and I was looking at the cover, she's sitting at Central Park, I was like, all right, I can go to Central Park, find perhaps that bench, and then all of a sudden I noticed that there is like a little piece of debris at the bottom of her, at the base of the bench that looks like a discarded coffee cup, and I thought, okay, so, you know, is it possible to even return to that location? And then as it turns out, no, because there's no relic of that bench anymore. I mean, there's a view of that iconic, bridge in the distance, but there's really nothing left. I mean, it's the same thing with Philadelphia. Like, there's really nothing left of Nina Simone at Central Park in Philadelphia, right? There's really nothing. And we noticed that, Richard, in the at the Rock and Roll Museum Hall of Fame. Like, it's like, how could something so important as popular music do such a horrible job in taking care of its material culture, of its past, right? Even something that's just, 10, 20 years old, like it's never been, it's not serious enough to ever be thought through, or is just so generic that, why bother unless you're going to heroize, that one electric guitar, or that, that.
So can I talk just because about everything has to come to this about Sun Ra in this context?
Yeah. We have to. I mean, we can catch my third book some other podcast. You can wrap us up.
All right. One of the great things that I purchased and I read this summer. This ties into what Kostic was talking about, and it, this gallery in Chicago called Corbett versus Dempsey re-released a bunch of Sun Ra's books, basically. So Sun Ra is this, for listeners who may not know, this avant-garde jazz musician who was very possessive of his own intellectual property in the sense, at a time where this was not always the case, right? Like, he owned his vast majority of his catalog, he owned a vast majority of his literary output, he owned, and he self-published in most cases. Now, we can speculate on why this was. That it wasn't entirely racial, and it wasn't entirely his kind of desire to be autonomous and independent. It was maybe some of his stuff isn't really all that great. But because he did this on his own, they were primarily sold at his concerts, right? And these things circulated to people who would come and hear the orchestra play. And Corbett versus Dempsey found copies of it and reproduced it in its original forms. No one can see this. To the point where some of them that were mimeographed, they reproduced using kind of facsimile mimeographing, the purple ink of being mimeographed, and it's in just loose pages, right? It just comes apart. It's loose pages, and it really creates. So all of these poems have been published in a big kind of complete the complete what is it, the terrestrial works of Sun Ra, and you know, by a German scholar, and put together in similar fonts and alphabetized for some weird reason, which that's how I like to engage my authors alphabetically. Anyway, but getting back to reading the things in these reproductions, right? But have this kind of type of authenticity to them, because this is actually how they were released and how they were originally done. Gave me a far greater appreciation of what Sun Ra was trying to do, right? And again, this probably bleeds into magical realism. It bleeds into narratives on race and on political autonomy that don't conform to kind of our neat spaces like carved out for social activism today. Sun Ra was a complicated figure who intersected with with the Black Arts movement in New York. He intersected with groups like the Nation of Islam during his time in Chicago. He intersected then in Philadelphia with like all sorts of different communities where he ran effectively. Almost like a mutual benefit community, like almost like an anarchist community not West Philly. Where is it?
In Germantown.
Germantown. Yeah, that's right.
Germantown, Mount Airy.
That's still kind of functioning today, right? And so that he positions himself in all these strange. There's all these strange juxtapositions to his work that in no way kind of characterize him, right? Like in no way are the hands of the Black Arts movement or what's going on in late 50s Chicago or even any sort of Philadelphia-ism to it too strongly like a hand on his bizarre individuality. So anyway, it makes me excited to see Ra making this kind of reemergence, especially as people are thinking more seriously about Afrofuturism and things like that. And locating him within this context of alternative ways of thinking about the kind of contemporary crises, right? Whether these are the crisis of race, whether it's a crisis of economic inequality, whether it's a crisis of COVID, whether it's a crisis of even climate change. I mean, Sun Ra was interested in this stuff. He didn't have solutions that always made sense. But I don't think the current series of solutions are particularly great either. So, like, why not? Why not read all of Sun Ra while listening to his 7,000 albums? Driving around in my diesel truck. I don't know. Like, it can't.
But Sun Ra was not obsessed with Kostis has to go. He has to go do, I don't know, some city guy thing. I don't know what they do.
Take a 13-year-old to her orthodontist.
Oh yeah, there you go. Well, we all have to do that.
We have to do that,
or versions thereof. Yeah. So, all right, thank you, Kostis.
We can maybe,
and we'll wrap it up. Yeah, I was just going to say, because Sun Ra is he was smart enough to not be trapped into thinking his solutions had to be consistent and make sense. So
I think there's certain truth to that, right? He didn't get I mean, in some ways, he was a product of his own. Although one, I guess, could argue that he was such a product of his own rhetoric that once you decide not to make sense, that becomes the or not to conform. That becomes the kind of most viable way forward, right? Like there's no coming back from being Sun Ra, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I was being a little facetious or reading what I wanted to read into Sun Ra, but it's a wonderful juxtaposition of what you said earlier about the balancing out the trust in the science, which has become trust in the science of the. Well, I haven't looked at the my select your favorite liberal media update of the afternoon, but what's the science of the last 15 minutes of Sun Ra does not play that game.
No. The CDC has not yet recommended Sun Ra yet.
God, that would be the greatest album of 2022. The CDC recommends Sun Ra.
Well, the orchestra is still making music. Marshall Allen, and I'm sure they'd be up for it. So wait, you have to tell us your final book. You have to tell me your final book.
Oh, okay, I'll go. It's a nonfiction. It is Rachel Marie Crane Williams, Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, the Detroit Uprising of 1943. Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed is a quote of one of the witnesses, participants, victims of the uprising in 1943. It was following on my Detroit theme. It's a graphic novel.
Oh, wow.
It's very cool. Rachel Marie Crane Williams is at the. Ooh, I can't get this wrong because I now know her. University of Iowa. I had to get the right Iowa University because you know how universities are touchy about that. University of Iowa, and she, of course, 1943. It pivots off of tensions in the city of Detroit and also some issues about employment for Black and African American workers. The Prez has said that everyone should be involved in the defense industry and everyone should be paid the same and treated equally, and that's not quite happening that way in the factories of Detroit, but Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, anywhere in the industrial Midwest, tensions rise. There's an uprising in 43. It's quite violent. There's it's the continuity that we know so well. But what Rachel did is she went into the archival sources. The NAACP sent out interviewers, and within those interviews, they spoke to a lot of the women in the community. So, of course, 43 has been studied a lot, but what had not been studied are what are the stories the women in the community were telling. So she went into those stories, and she's an artist. She's not a historian, but grabbed compelling stories from the women and words and images as she conceived them from the stories that were in there and what she knew of Detroit and the other histories, and combined it all together into a really very cool graphic novel. It's not really a linear plot. It's snapshots. I mean, because it's an uprising. It's a riot. What do you get? You don't get a linear story. You get snapshots. But there's all kinds of really cool things in there. I learned about double V for victory, victory at home, victory abroad, which was emphasizing that we expect people to fight in the field, in the trenches. We also need to have victory for civil rights at home. I was so impressed by it. I sent Rachel an email and said, hey, I'm at Central Michigan University, and we are always trying to do cool outreach projects in Detroit. Let's do something. And that's grown into, I'm just a simple country dean, or now a simple country interim provost. So I'm not a big player in this, but she's now linked up with our Detroit office and the Detroit History Museum and Inside Out Literary Arts Program, and they're going to be working with high school students focused on uprisings, and there's going to be poetry and an art project. So that's pretty good impact from me being distracted and bored and needing a book to read.
So do you think Detroit... I'm trying to... So a couple of the... I follow some British record labels, and they've become fascinated. I mean, this is 25 years, 30 years later, right? By some of these Detroit record labels, particularly Strata, or the Strata Corporation, which put out, I don't know, loosely, I think we might call it today like soul jazz. It's late 60s, early 70s. Very, very urban jazz that was for a very particular audience who had clear expectations. They put out some really brilliant albums that are very much Detroit albums. And there are a couple other Detroit labels that have recently similar dates that have also seen their stuff being re-released. I happen to have sitting right next to me Krista Rzuski's Detroit Remains.
Yeah.
And I'm beginning to wonder if the kind of, without getting apocalyptic or overly dramatic, if the current national mood is such where Detroit has gone from being a kind of, I don't want to call it this is probably too strong, but like a national tragedy, a national disgrace even, like, oh my God, like, because I remember where you would hear like X will become the next Detroit should this or this transpire, right?
Right.
To actually a story of a much more complex and nuanced story, because we're beginning to see that Detroit wasn't this kind of isolated disaster, but actually anticipated the contemporary situation. That we are all in Detroit now, and that like we better go and figure out like not only what happened socioeconomically in Detroit, which is I think economically and politically in Detroit, which is maybe a straightforward story in some ways, but actually what's happened socially and artistically and what the future of Detroit is, because that could be one of our ways out as a society, American society or whatever.
Yeah, and Detroit is, and I'm no expert on Detroit. I've
read 3 books and listened to a bunch of albums.
Yeah, right. I go.
But do you think there's? I mean, I know you're in Michigan, so maybe you get a biased view. But do you feel like there's like a recent interest in Detroit that is national?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's more interest in Detroit. Some of it's very sort of superficial. Detroit is back. You can get property cheap and gentrify it, and some of it's not even gentrification because it's just sitting there, man. It's not gentrification if it's just sitting there. But some of it's just that's gentrification. Some of it's just superficial nonsense. But some of it's a much deeper interest in the real resilience of
like 43 riots,
Detroit, because it's
like
been
43 Detroit riots. Like I know about them vaguely, but this is not something that I would imagine.
I mean, it's the story. I mean, Detroit is, when you look at, there's stuff that precedes one of the Dr. Ossian Sweet, way before 43, was in his house in Detroit. I can't put a date on the top of my head, but it's many years before 43 is in his house. He's a prominent African-American doctor. Some local good old boys are harassing him and burning crosses and doing the sorts of things they do. Someone in the house takes a shot out the window, kills one of them, and there's no conviction. And he remains a prominent leader in the community, and is important also in 1943. And there's all kinds of very early interesting stuff happening in 43. There's a lot of leadership for the civil rights movement coming out of, not for us, ancient historians early, but things preceding 43 coming out of Detroit. And some of the stuff that, especially for the young folks, will be Black Lives Matter is like, come on, man, we did that in Detroit, not only in 43, but predating 43. This is a repeat story. And then, you know more about music than I do, but what was happening, not just in Motown's super interesting, but it's also, it's sanitized and marketed, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a thing. But there's all the other things related to it. Man, there's a lot. And it's been there all along. Detroit didn't just because the formal, I'm ranting a bit, but just because the formal, monetized, bureaucratized part of Detroit collapsed and there had to be a takeover of the city government. that doesn't matter to, I mean, it matters a lot, but on the other hand, it doesn't matter to a lot of people who have seen this cycle through again and again. So, yeah, I think things like failed city services, fragmentation of communities, and that's a Detroit story that goes back a long way. So we talk about this with when I can squeeze out the time with some of my colleagues on campus about, and it's, it's not my area of expertise or my area of experience, but how much what's happened in the uprisings of the past few years is not new. It's been happening here in Michigan for a very long time. It's, okay, that's cool. Let's keep doing it, but not new. Nothing's changed. It's just the same old.
Yeah. And I wonder if the growing cultural interest in Detroit, there's, I think you're absolutely right. Like Motown is known about, right? Some of these big events are known about, but this growing cultural interest in Detroit is that maybe Detroit anticipated this and has ways out that aren't just more privatization, aren't just more government, more privatization, whatever these kind of institutional solutions are. Maybe there are deeper. Maybe there are solutions that are grounded in the resilience of communities and the character of social networks and cultural expression that we can look toward to understand our current situation better, and to not just become, despondent.
Right. I mean, there are other cities as resilient as Detroit, but not many. I mean, what city has a population, and again, I'm talking about the people who actually live there, who've stayed all along, who are more resilient, and in their origins, because much of Detroit is born out of the Great Migration. People coming up because there were jobs before World War II. They're coming up for industry to get away from the oppression and lack of opportunity in the South, and those families and communities just they keep going, and the snapshot stereotypical images don't capture what's actually happening there. It's been really frustrating to me, because it was one of the things I was really interested in learning more about coming up here to Michigan, is what's going on in Detroit, and COVID has just screwed that up. I mean, it's not like I have the time or the ability or the skill set to really, get in there and learn a whole bunch. But I mean, it's truncated the ability to do any of that. But I mean, I'll get to it. But it's been like our short hiatus in the podcast. it's been delayed. So I end up doing, it's fun. I don't mind going to the Detroit Institute of Arts. It's a great museum, and it's never crowded. So it's one of my favorites, actually. You don't have to look at people taking selfies in front of the art. You can actually see the art. But it's the safe option in a COVID time frame. So that's what I end up doing. I haven't been able to do the more interesting options.
Well, it's good. Leave something for the future.
Exactly.
Get all the good stuff
Maybe,
all at once. Then what do you have for dessert?
Exactly. Maybe next week. We'll see. I'm not looking at the paper again until Monday, so I don't know.
All right.
Okay, that wraps us up for season 4, episode 1. So thank you for joining us. All right, I'll do it. I'll hopefully this recorded. I won't get to it till this weekend, but I'll type up some quick notes.
I'll send you some references and links to stuff I talked about.
Yeah, some of the more obscure stuff would speed me along on that.
I'll leave it to Kostic to prepare his extensive bibliography on the.
I somehow suspect I won't be getting that
It's hard to say.
in full, but you never know. So,
All right, Richard. Yeah,
all right,
thanks. Yeah.
sounds good.
Bye.
All right, take care.